I'd like to call this meeting to order. May we have the roll call?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Bofi?
Present.
Dr. Bofi is present. Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Davis is present. Ms. Edmonston? Mr. Garvey? Mr. Garvey is present. Ms. Holloway? Present. Ms. Holloway is present. Dr. Jones?
Present with a squelch.
Dr. Jones is present. Ms. Lewis?
I'm present.
Ms. Lewis is present. Ms. Orange Jones is not in attendance. Mr. Rock?
Present.
Mr. Rock is present. Dr. Thomason? Present. Dr. Thomason is present. Ms. Vautier? Here. Ms. Vautier is present. And Mr. Bowman?
Present.
Mr. Bowman is present. You do have quorum.
What's our first item?
Your consent agenda is ready for your approval, adding item 3.1.
So moved.
Ms. Fauché moves, and we get a second from Dr. Thomason. Thank you. What's our next item?
Your first item is on page 1, item 2.1, consideration of a discussion regarding Rapides Training Academy relative to accountability. The recommendation is to receive.
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Fauché, and a second by Mr. Rock. Superintendent, would you like to speak on this one?
I can give the floor to Dr. Jones, other than saying that I'm looking forward to resolving this issue.
This item
Dr.
was
Jones,
I'm sorry.
would you like to hear public testimony first, or would you like to share your comments?
I'd like to set the stage and then
Okay.
because I put this item on and
All right.
if it's all right, and then there's some questions I'd like to ask afterwards. This particular item, I asked about a month ago, I guess it was, to put it on the agenda before I knew about the discussion that was likely to come up about the charter school with the Fs that we did an alternate framework for. This, to set a little bit of the stage for the board, Rapides Training Academy is a very specialized school. It has institutionalized children. There are about 60 kids there that are at the lowest area educationally, and it came out of a Rapides Training Academy came out of a school that used to be on the St. Mary's campus years and years ago. And about when I was superintendent, it suddenly came to our attention that those kids were from all over the United States and all over the state of Louisiana, and Rapides Parish was bearing the burden of it to the tune of about $1.6 million per year coming out of the general fund budget, and the only recompense they were getting for it was $165,000 from the legislature. And even that went away. And so we ended up in a big, messy lawsuit. But at the end of the day, what happened was a legislator from Walls Parish put a bill through that said that Rapides Parish was responsible for educating those children, and then they were supposed to turn around and collect the money back from the districts whose children were really in there. And traditionally, about a third of the districts refused to pay, and they didn't put any collection way in there and so forth. But that's not the real issue. The issue here is this is a school that by our regular assessment framework has a school performance score of about 1.5. Right? And if they'll never have any opportunity to have anything but that under our current framework. And so the discussion we had this morning about the charter schools and how we were doing the alternative framework and so forth for those schools, to judge them based on what their mission was and what they were doing. Dr. Shum came to the table and made the point that needed to apply to everyone, and that's really the point of this issue today. There are some representatives here from Rapides Parish who would like to talk about it, but I guess what I'm asking is that whenever we do anything involving an alternative framework for these schools, that we consider an alternative framework for this school. And I'll be candid, back when I was superintendent, I told them not to worry about it, because at that time, after 5 years of failure, the state was taking it over. And we knew that realistically it was never going to get to a satisfactory score. I said, don't worry about it. 5 years from now, they'll take it over. But 5 years came and went, and we got out of the business of taking them over. So they're suffering the effect of having that in their district performance score, and a school with an F rating that serves a very, very specialized group. The kids at this school are so low performing that at one point we had to put the doorknobs up at 5 feet so we could keep a kid in a classroom. So just to give you some idea what kind of thing. So I know we've got some comment cards, and now I'd like for us to have the public comment, please.
Well, Mr. Rock, would you like to speak?
Just to follow up on what Dr. Jones said, of course, this school, just to go back a little bit farther than he did, one of the former bishops of the Diocese of Alexandria, Bishop Greco, who was from New Orleans and became bishop of the Diocese of Alexandria, maybe a little bit off, around 1945, 46, somewhere along in there. And Bishop Greco had a passion for a word that we no longer use in education today, but Bishop referred to those kids basically since they were so low as what we used to say kids who were retarded, and so Bishop was instrumental in opening that school first at Clark's, Louisiana, which is on 165 going to Monroe. And he opened it there in Army barracks for kids, and they came from, as Dr. Jones said, from all over the country. And then Bishop moved the school to north on Highway 1, just north of Alexandria. Oh, I forgot exactly what year that was, but somewhere back there. Some years later, he bought the land right adjacent to the airport. At that time, it was the air base, and that's where they are now located. And those kids, like I said, are extremely, extremely, extremely low. Yeah.
We'll go ahead and have the public comment. Vicki Smith with Rapides Parish, Nason Adama with Rapides Parish School Board, Keith Brazell with Rapides Parish School Board, and Deborah Shum with Louisiana Association of Principals. Who would like to start? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Board. And I'm representing, my name is Keith Brazil. I'm the president of the Rapides Parish School Board. And I'm here representing the board and our desire to move forward RTA, which is the Rapides Training Academy. And my comments are going to be very brief, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Odemont, who is our superintendent, who will speak more at it. But what we desire is this alternative framework that you're speaking about, and I didn't know that this other part was going to happen this morning. And so this just dovetails or succinctly with that. And so I just wanted to be here to say that the Rapides Parish School Board is in full support of trying to get an alternative framework for this school. We're not looking to quit trying to educate these children. Most of our education is in life skills at this time, and we do a very good job with it. And if you want to judge us or to categorize the school, we would like to be in that framework of seeing where a child begins with us and where a child ends with us. And so I just wanted to be here in support of this motion and in support of an alternative framework with this school. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Nason Odemont.
Can you make sure your mic is on? The green light will stay on when it is. Very good.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Boffey, members of the board, Superintendent White. My name is Nason Odemont. I serve as superintendent of schools in Rapides. Give you some background information on this situation, and will, in all likelihood, reiterate some of the things that Mr. Rock and Dr. Jones have already alluded to. The Rapides Parish school system is a school system of 50 schools, one of which is the Rapides Parish or the Rapides Training Academy. The Rapides Training Academy services our autistic and our severe and profound mentally disabled students ages 6 through 22, the vast majority of them having mental abilities ranging in age from 12 months to 5 years of age. There's currently about 60 kids enrolled in the school. 26 of them this year took the state assessment, or last year actually. The results of that, again, as Dr. Jones mentioned, the SPS, the school performance score for Rapides Training Academy, came in at 1.8. which clearly made it the lowest performing school in the entire state.
And Tony, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to clarify, that's the Law 1 assessment, is
Yes, that
right?
is correct.
Got it. Thank
That's
you.
right.
Not the LEAP.
Right.
Thank you.
And of course, historically, it has been an F school, and it has ranked in the first percentile of all schools across the state, year in, year out. The issue is that obviously these kids do not have the mental capacity to demonstrate any level of proficiency on the assessment that is currently being administered to them. Most of these kids struggle with basic life skills, getting dressed in the morning, eating on their own. They have the most basic levels of communication. Some of them are actually nonverbal. And so it is a foregone conclusion before these kids ever take the state assessment as to what the results are going to be. And the historical performance and results clearly point to that. So our issue is that we are not opposed to these kids being assessed and evaluated. We want them to be fairly evaluated on what their skills and their abilities are. So again, we're asking, again, not knowing that this conversation and some of these other agenda items on previous committees were going to be here, we want to be held accountable, but again, we want these kids to be measured based on their skills and their abilities, and that's our position. Thank you.
Ms. Smith? Press the button, and the light will stay on. Very good.
My name is Vicki Smith, and I'm the Director of Special Education for Rapides Parish. I'm new to this position, but I'm here today on behalf of these 59 students that are at Rapides Training Academy. I would like to support the board in their decision to ask for relief for the accountability system that these students are currently under. We recently visited the school to prepare for upcoming testing and to see what the students are going to have to go through for testing that's coming soon, even though it is an alternative assessment. It was very upsetting to see that, and we just would like some more appropriate accountability for these students. Thank you.
Ms. Shum?
Thank you very much. Debbie Shum with Louisiana Association of Principals. And following up on what we said earlier this morning, and I want to thank the board members for bringing to our attention that there are some concerns about making sure that whatever we assess one school with on alternative placements, that we look at doing that for all schools. This to me clearly says, and I did not know that this was going to come up this afternoon, but I knew that there was some issues with non-charter public schools who have indeed special populations that would benefit from looking at a specific determination of what those students in those schools do and how they grow. And what I would ask is, clearly this situation came up with the charter schools last year, 1 year ago. And 1 year from that point, there's a new policy that allows them to get some looking at that measure. Here I just heard that this happened more than 5 years ago for this school, and I heard this morning from Superintendent Boucher that she's been working on the alternative schools getting a different rating for over 10 years. So I would ask that this board use some sense of urgency in defining a policy that will help those schools that have special populations at a quicker rate than what has previously happened. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Jones.
And I just want to echo a little bit there. You know, when a school has an F rating and the lowest rating in the state, when it doesn't have any similarity to the accountability system that's used to rate it, and those teachers come to work every day knowing that they're working at the worst school. And by the way, if you ever get an opportunity, you should visit that school and see what those teachers do. It's incredible what they do with those kids. Most of those kids live in the institution from the time that the parents send them there or relinquish custody. I think actually about probably 20% of those kids are, I don't even know where they're from. Some of them may be from out of state. The parents have actually relinquished custody to St. Mary's for those kids. But the thing about it is that we've known about this now for over 10 years. I know I left superintendency there in 2012, and that had been going on for at least 5 or 6 years before that. what is important here is to me is to find a framework that applies to charter and regular public schools that is a fair assessment of what those people are doing and what those kids are learning and so forth. It actually always surprised me. It takes a very special group of teachers that are willing to work in that particular setting to stay there. Many of them have been there for many, many years. But it's not right. And I would ask that we put a sense of urgency on this and somehow or another develop a framework that we're going to use. Maybe we have to evaluate each one of these situations independently of the other situations and agree on a framework for those. But there should be an opportunity. A school shouldn't have to carry a school performance score of 1.8. I thought it was 1.5. Y'all did better than I thought you did this year.
So is it... I'm sorry, Dr. Jones.
Well, I'll yield.
I guess I just have a couple of questions. I agree and understand the sense of urgency here. To the members of the panel, is the problem that we're trying to solve that the kids are not getting services that they need, or that the adults are not being evaluated fairly, or the quality of the institution is not being evaluated fairly? Well,
let me answer that question another way. Are you saying a 1.8 school performance score would be indicative of the job the teachers are doing or what the kids are learning in this case?
I'm not asking a rhetorical question. I'm literally asking what is the mission that we're trying to achieve. Because here's what I would say. When you create a system, an accountability system, people go do the stuff that the system asks you to do. So before we go down the road of trying to create a new accountability system, I want to understand what we're actually trying to accomplish in having this discussion. So is the goal of raising this here at this meeting to improve the services being provided to the children, or is the goal to create a better evaluation of the institution?
Well, what is the goal of accountability? Isn't it both of those?
Yes.
Okay. And so wouldn't that be a natural result of if we improved the evaluation system so that it was fair, and if it was a fair assessment of what kind of skills we're providing for the kids, wouldn't that be accomplished by doing what we're talking about?
Well, it depends, because how do other parishes handle similar situations where you have a school that is, from what it sounds, Tony, these are not just students that are Law 1, but it sounds like these are very low-functioning students within our population?
That's right.
So even within the 1%, or it's actually...
But Superintendent White, the answer to that is they send them to Rapides. That's the point.
Got it.
They send them to Rapides.
Okay, but so therein is an important distinction that I think we need to tease out here, which is that actually this situation where you have every student who meets these particular criteria in one school is not the way they're treated. And this is not a criticism, but it is to say this then is a fairly unique situation. Is that right? So if you create a separate model for this school, does then, if Superintendent Vaucher wanted to create that type of school in St. Bernard, would she then be able to do that under that model?
I would think so.
Well, so this is sort of where I'm going, which is there are larger implications to this question than just this school. Because if you create a model that is specific to this school, and I'm not saying, Dr. Jones, we shouldn't do that, but I do think it does have an effect on student learning in other places. Because what you're basically saying is, we think this is something that's good, and we think we should do it elsewhere, because we've created a system of goals that suggest that this is what good schooling in this types of settings look like. And I don't think you can talk about the question of how you create an alternative framework for this institution without saying this could be okay in every parish in the state to create this type of institution. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, and maybe that's the right answer, but I think the minute you say we're creating a separate system for this school, it's totally fair game for other parishes to say, well, we want a school like that. And we would have to wrestle with, do we want to say yes to that?
I have a question that I want to ask just as a clarification for you, Superintendent. Are all of the students in the school classified as special education students?
Yes.
Okay, that's a very helpful distinction. Ms. Fauché, I know that you would like to speak. I'm going to give you that opportunity. Before you get started, in the school in your district that you've talked about, are all of the students in that school classified as having as special education students?
Not my alternative
Not
school,
your
no.
alternative school? Okay,
No.
and go ahead. You have the floor.
You know, as we've been talking about this all day long, and it is not a simple situation to deal with. We've created an alternative framework for the children with dyslexia. They're asking for an alternative framework for a different type of disability, in this case, a very significant disability, what we used to call the old severe and profound, the extremely lowest level of significant disabilities from a cognitive perspective. We could go across the state in every district and create little schools for dyslexia, for significant disabilities, for incarcerated students, on and on and on and on and on. And I still, at this point, in my own mind, am very confused as to what I truly believe in terms of full inclusion versus segregating different groups of students with similar disabilities. You know, you have some parents who want that type of structure, as we saw with those students with dyslexia that wanted their own school. Obviously, this group of parents who feel that this is the best place for their child. But in a very larger context, in traditional school systems, there are children, like every child has been described all day long in all schools in the state of Louisiana. I observed, you're talking about the LA1, the old LA1 assessment. We're now going to, I guess, Louisiana Connect, and I haven't seen it yet because this will be the first year that's being given. But nonverbal children with a cognitive level of an infant or a toddler, I have seen us read a 4th or 5th grade test to them, even if it's a LA1, and you read the test, you know the child isn't responding because he's nonverbal. Sits there, says nothing. You read it a second time. The child does not respond. You read it a third time. Child does not respond. Whoop, 0 wrong on that question, go to the next one. And we go through with some children with very significant disabilities, knowing that they cannot even respond to the question being asked, and go through, and I'm going to just say, in my opinion, the charade of reading questions to them, knowing we're getting none, and putting them through the indignity of that assessment. I don't know what the new Louisiana Connect assessment is going to look like with those children with significant disabilities, but I know intuitively there's just got to be a better way to do this.
But I think that, so I don't disagree with you. You're right that this is not obviously the right answer.
No,
obviously this is
not the right answer. I don't know what is.
Right, exactly. And
and
that's what I'm with you. It's too. I sit there and I look at what we saw from the parents at Louisiana Key, and I'm like, gosh, all this rhetoric around no, least restrictive environment, everything doesn't seem to be right in this case. On the other hand, I think that if you were to say anybody can sequester any student group that they want into any school unit that they want, you'd be rolling back 40 years of progress in special education and other groups. Mm. So I think we need to approach this with accountability as one option. In other words, maybe there is a better accountability system. But if I may offer a couple of other things, I'm assuming that the students in St. Bernard Parish who meet these criteria largely attend St. Bernard Parish Public Schools. They don't go somewhere else.
That's correct.
Half of the kids, as I understand it, Tony, in this school come from somewhere else.
Oh, way more than
More
that.
than half. Okay.
2/3.
So part of the issue here is that one school in one parish is serving an abnormally large percentage of the students in this state who have the cognitive capacities that we're describing here today. That's one issue that probably could be discussed. Who is responsible for these students? Let me raise a second question. We have other facilities like this in our state that, for better or for worse, sequester students by group. LSDVI, or LSD and LSVI. The Special Education Center in Rapides Parish, which serves a very broad spectrum of disabilities. However, and Key Academy, and the MAX. However, in each of those cases, a local governing entity is not the one that bears the responsibility of accountability. The state bears the responsibility of accountability. Why? Because it's a special circumstance. And so I guess I'm raising for you, for both of you, that I agree we need to solve this solution that Superintendent has brought to us today. I am concerned about jumping to the conclusion that the answer has to be treat the school differently from an accountability perspective, because I have more fundamental questions as to whether, A, parish 30 parishes contributing to one school is the right way to think about accountability, and B, whether a local governance entity taking on the lion's share of a statewide group of kids is a responsible way to think about this in the first place, before we even get to questions of how do we calculate SPS.
Okay, well,
Go ahead, Ms.
still at
Bochet.
4, you know, it's a bigger it's just a bigger issue than that. We have assessment, we have accountability, we have basic dignity with children. And we need to see that children improve to their maximum potential, and we need to celebrate their accomplishments. So I don't have the answer, Superintendent. I really, John, I don't have the answer to these things. But I do know that what we're doing in accountability for these kids is wrong. In assessment, which works into accountability. And I know in my district, you know, I try to tell our special ed people, I'm not going to worry about all that. We're going to try to do the right thing and what's good for kids. But it's so difficult when those teachers have to assess children with the instruments we're using, and we know there are children like the ones that we're describing right now that should not be suffering through those types of assessments. Then we've got other children on that spectrum of children with disabilities who are going to excel and need to be assessed with a similar, but this is significantly disabled children. And this is where, not having seen the new one yet, but looking at the actual standards, the connectors, I don't know if I'm getting my terms right, connectors, connect, and all that, but it's hard for me to envision that this new assessment is even going to be more difficult to administer and assess for these types of children. And there's got to be some recognition of that. And there's got to be a movement toward how are we going to effectively assess these children. Yeah. And forget, you know, it's one thing to worry about the school and the district and the score, and we're all worried about that, I know, from an institutional perspective, but even on a more basic level from the perspective of that child and that family.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I think, you know, Rebecca, our team, we can engage in a discussion of the assessment of students within the 1%. I will say this. We have expanded significantly. We've doubled the size, I think, for better and for worse, of the 1% category since the onset of the NCLB waivers, since Law 2 went away. There is an extraordinary range, cognitive range within that 1.5%, as you alluded to. The federal law errs on the side of saying, no, you're going to assess every one of those kids with an instrument that is the same instrument. Whether it's the right instrument or not, I think we can engage in a discussion with Rebecca and with your special ed directors and others about. But the law is very clear. Every child gets assessed because the law doesn't trust the system to make the distinctions that you're describing. You can argue that one way or the other. So the question is then, in a context where we admit that there may be students, and I'm the first to admit, for whom even a Law 1 assessment may not be fully developmentally appropriate, cognitively appropriate, how do you handle the fact that under the law, and just morally, someone must be responsible for their education, accountable? And I am the first to agree. One institution taking a huge share of such students from across the state and bearing all the responsibility at a local level, that doesn't on its face make a lot of sense to me. Again, I'm just not sure that the right answer in this case is to say we should create a new framework that would allow this to be done in a bunch of other places before we ask a basic question of why is the local the one bearing the responsibility for 30 for students whose families reside in 30 different parishes?
Well, it's 59 kids, 26 who are assessed. I mean, there's a lot more than 59 kids throughout the state.
Absolutely.
That are having these kinds of, or schools are having those kinds of issues. Whether those 59 kids come from one parish, 10 parishes, or 50, or 64, however many we have, parishes in the state, to me is a different perspective from what are we doing with them and how are we assessing them. And I don't care where the kids come from. And within our own districts, we have large, well, not large numbers, but we have numbers of children. If you say every district has 1% of their assessed kids in this category, or maybe 0.5%, you're coming out with more students than what this one school has. So 59 children, 26 being assessed, getting an SPS, I feel your pain, but from a very larger context, there are many, many more children out there throughout our state that are going through those same types of things within the schools that they're sitting on, and faculties and staffs, and we're all grappling with how do we best assess those children. And that spectrum you're talking about for the significantly disabled goes from, and I hate to use IQ scores, but that's sort of what they're doing, from almost not being able to measure them through an IQ of about 55-ish, I think, before you get into the old Lot 2, which moves up. That's a very wide spectrum of cognitive ability children. You know, we've got some kids who are cognitively on an infant level or a toddler level being assessed with these tests. And then we have some that are a little bit more advanced than that within that spectrum. So John, honestly, I don't have an answer. I just know that it's a problem that we have to look at and try to work toward addressing, not only for one school in Rapides Parish, but for children throughout this state.
I am interested in knowing how many parishes have students who attend the school.
Currently, we have 18 parishes.
18 parishes. And is there anyone out at, like, do you pull children from out of state?
Well, actually, you don't really know, because what happens in that case, when this whole issue first surfaced, we had a real messy lawsuit. And what happened was the ones that were out of state turned parental custody over to St. Mary's School. There are 11...
Wait, what is St. Mary's School?
Well, that was the original name.
The precursor to
it was a precursor to the...
Okay, so this started as a private school.
It started as a Catholic mission.
Okay.
We operated a school on that campus, even though the name of that campus is St. Mary's School. It wasn't a school, but we operated a school there for 20, 25 years, and then we moved it to another. But what actually happened here was it was a very messy lawsuit, and our position was that it was the state's responsibility, and we had an agreement worked out to where they were going to put it in a special school district, but the former superintendent scotched that deal on a Monday morning. And so at that point, a legislator from Boyles Parish, who apparently had a relative that was a student at the school, put a bill through that transferred the responsibility totally to Rapides Parish, and also required Rapides Parish to go back to the other parishes where the kids their parents were actually living, to collect the money back from them for the MFP from them. And they get about 2/3 of it, but they still lose. But the issue here, and I want to keep bringing it back to this. My analogy here is we've got an accountability system where we're trying to determine whether or not kids are being educated and whether or not adults are doing the job they're supposed to do. But in effect, we're giving these kids an exam on aeronautical engineering. And yet just 2 hours ago, we approved 2 charter schools with a very specialized framework that we recognized was different from everything else. But for some reason or another, we're not going to hold that, we're not going to take that same standard, give that same consideration to a school like this. And by the way, Superintendent, the reason that the other parishes don't is because they have the ability to send those kids to Rapides. Rapides does not have a choice as to whether they take those kids or not. Realize that these kids, most of them are at St. Mary's from the time they're 2, 3 years old, and they stay there till they're 22, and then they go into a group house next door. Okay, so these are not in any way a typical distribution of kids in a school system.
I guess, Dr. Jones, my point is only, I don't disagree with you. We have never, in my time, created a new SPS formula for any school. Now, I have agreed with Ms. Voce and others that have advocated that we should, because I don't think we're going to see change toward quality in alternative schools until we do. But there is going to have to be a discussion, and we've been planning to have this in March, about, well, which groups of students do you allow that for? And it's one thing to say a charter is still an F, but we're going to allow it to continue to operate. That's a very different thing from saying any school in this state, based on the fact that it has a homogeneous grouping of kids, is eligible for getting an SPS a different way, especially when the whole push on special ed has been toward integration, not toward sequestration. That's not to argue that we shouldn't have a solution here. We should. And I'm happy to sit down and do whatever discussion we need to do to do it. But my point is, let's do it in a way that doesn't risk the proliferation of something that we don't want to proliferate.
I asked you the specific question this morning of what would show up when those charter schools come back up for renewal. And was it still going to show an F and then an asterisk mark saying that we evaluate it? I asked that for a specific reason. Because if we say you're an F, but you're not an F, then we haven't done anything. So my impression was, when we started this discussion, that we weren't going to keep hanging an F grade on that school. We were going to give a grade to them based on what framework we decided that was the appropriate way to evaluate. And all I'm saying is that there are public schools in the state that have those same things, and I don't want to see them come up with an F, and then, because we're not going to close them. Let's be honest. So at what point, how do we differ with a school like this, for example? In the old days, we said after 5 years, you were eligible for takeover. But guess what? You don't want them. That's a difficult mission, and the state's no more qualified to provide a service any better than what they're already providing. All I'm seeking here is for us to get this issue solved to where accountability means what we're measuring is how good a job you're doing based on what you should be doing.
The problem is
Mr.
that
White.
accountability. I'm sorry.
Ms. Edmonston has been waiting patiently.
Please.
First of all, I want to thank you because I'm familiar with St. Mary, and if I'm not mistaken, St. Mary is probably the only school in the state who does this. Superintendent, do you know of any other schools that do what they do as they've described?
No.
Okay. No. I'm pretty sure you're the only one. Do you know of any others? No. So this is definitely a unique circumstance, and I appreciate the length of time that you've done this. I have a son that's 35 with Down syndrome, and St. Mary was around when he was born, and we knew people who had kids that were cognitively very challenged, and they went to St. Mary, so I appreciate that. What I would like to hear us as a board talk about is children and not systems, children and not schools, that we would look at children somehow, and I don't know how we would do this, but that we need to look at children before we look at accountability. What are you able to do? What in 5 years can we expect from you? Can we expect that you will get up to the level of other kids in your cases? Absolutely not. So to me, we are remiss in what we're doing in assessing lots of kids. So I appreciate Superintendent. I believe that he really sees that this is just inequitable. It's been inequitable ever since it started. I'm tired of hearing myself talk about it, and y'all probably are too. So all I would ask is that we begin to have conversation about this, John.
Well, I think the question about accountability is, if you want to talk about kids, if you want to create separate systems for kids based on their needs, which kids do you want to do it for? And I think that probably this Superintendent Audemont and his team cannot wait for us to work through that question. They need a solution more urgently. So I would suggest that, and Tony and I have never talked about this issue. We've texted or emailed about it, but I would suggest that Tony and I sit down and work it through and try to come up with something that solves their problem expediently. But we're going to need help, and this board is going to need to get to, if you want to pursue an alternate formula for schools, which of the tens of thousands of students in this state that have extraordinary needs fit under that rubric. And I believe we need a working group or something of members from this board to address that question. It's too complicated for this type of setting.
And I believe that probably the reason we've never tackled it is because it's so complicated, and we have the accountability system, and then we have individual children, and we've never really, for whatever reason, haven't ever merged the two. So I think it's time. I think the public is system leaders. I think people are, this is, like we say, we've been talking about this for the past 3.5 hours in some form or fashion. So I'm not saying an alternate system, I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm saying that I definitely want to be part of a group that begins to talk about it.
Mr. Davis, were you volunteering for the working group?
I was absolutely not, but I'll leave that to folks better, maybe more prepared than I am. But I was going to bring, I thought maybe just a little closer to finish discussion. The superintendent, I think, hit on this, which is, I think there are two issues here that we need to address that are related but separate, and I think that the more immediate need is recognizing that we have to find a solution, I think, for the Rapid school system in terms of this school and the role where it fits. I do think that's a standalone issue that warrants its own discussion, Superintendent, to your point with your discussions with Superintendent Alderman. But separately is the discussion, which is a much larger, much hairier discussion in terms of separate accountability and how we look at that. I respect and agree that this opens up a tremendous can of worms in terms of who then qualifies, what groups qualify for a separate scale. And so there's a lot of responsibility to be taken with that and a lot of discussion, which we are not going to be able to have today up here. So certainly I would say that I think it's imperative for us as a board to think about this, I think, in two ways. One is the immediate situation with this particular facility, school, and its relationship with the local educational association. And then separately, how do we begin the discussion through a work group or otherwise with stakeholders to really, and immediately, to the point Michelle made earlier, of timeliness, of really hitting this head on now, of what it looks like. That's a big discussion. It's going to take a little time, I believe, but I don't know that we have hit that head on as directly as we could have in the past. I think it's certainly time to do so. But I don't think we should conflate the two and try to solve them at once together, but at once separately.
Mr. Garvey, was that volunteering for the working group?
No, I was volunteering
Okay.
to ask a question.
All right, Mr. Garvey.
When you talk about trying to assess individual students according to their individual circumstance or according to the circumstances that they share with a very small population around the state, and if you exclude the nonverbal students, my question is why wouldn't the value-added portion of our evaluation give you a good indication of whether that student is progressing better than other similarly situated students around the state? And why couldn't you use that as a major portion of evaluating schools that are addressing a very unusual population? Would that not do it, or
I think
is that, am I
the
missing
point that
something?
Ms. Boucher is making is effectively there is a very small set of students for whom the instrument that we use is just not finely enough. It just doesn't measure the gradations of development that they have. And for example,
But the feds require us, they
Yes.
prohibit us from giving them a separate test. So
Correct.
there's nothing we can do to change that.
well, you can change the test.
Yeah. I thought the feds prohibited us from.
Well, they have a peer review process. There are standards it has to meet. I mean, the premise of IDEA and the premise of ESSA is that every student must be pursuing the traditional standards. Now, that is probably a gross oversimplification of what every student lies in their future, but that is the orientation. And they don't approve a plan for the alternate assessment unless you can show that the standards, even for a student who's nonverbal, connect to the standards for every other student. And that makes it very difficult to either have a different assessment for the 1% of kids or to have an assessment that it does the things, I think, Mr. Garvey, that you're describing. But so I think what we should do is, and we can look at the assessment, by the way, and Mr. Garvey, if you all would like, we can demonstrate the assessment, we can talk with people about it. But I think that probably the question that's on the table is not, can we get to a point where either we don't assess students or we have an assessment that is literally differentiated within the 1%. I don't think either of those is likely to happen. And instead, I think we should talk about, very specifically, how are we going to handle this situation? And I'm happy to meet with Mr. Audemont and with anyone else of you, obviously Dr. Jones or anyone else, to sit down and talk through the options. And then two, what is it we're going to do as we come up on this alternative school question, number one. Two, we've been talking about the schools that service students with dyslexia, number two. And now we have this situation and those like it. And by the way, we're dealing with LSDVI, Kathy, right at the same time. So we have all these things coming up, and at some point we're going to have to make a decision, what is an alternative school? And we don't have that in our rules right now. So until we codify that, we can't really talk about how do you create an accountability system for one, because we haven't even defined what it is.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, I know you said we have to deal with this particular school in this particular situation, but I'm not sure what we're dealing with. I mean, all of our alternative schools right now are, just about all of them in the state are F-rated schools in accountability, just like this, whether SPS is a 1.8 or a 32 or a 25 or 15 or whatever the magic number is. So every one of these schools throughout the state is in the same boat, maybe not to the degree that this Rapides is, but the sanctions are they're all in comprehensive intervention required and eligible for school redesign funds and are supposed to work through plans where they're going to show improvement. So I'm not sure what we're being asked to do for this particular school that 20 other schools in the state aren't in the same, they're in the same situation.
I would say, Ms. Fauché, that I see this as not as the alternative school that I hear you describe. This sounds like a special ed school to me. So all of the students in this school are identified as special ed. They're all receiving special ed services. This sounds like a different school than the way that I understand your alternative school to work and the way that I've experienced alternative schools through my experience. And so I think the superintendent offering a solution for this particular school, but then also talking about the fact that we're going to define what an alternative school is, and following that, figure out what that framework will be for an alternative school are the right next steps for the board. And then there are this has been a very nuanced discussion. I think that is helped me. I hope other board members see the various layers of this work and the potential conversations around assessment. So I don't think we're going to get any closer to a solution in this conversation. Are there any other motions that anyone would like to offer? Or Dr. Jones, you put it on the agenda. I'll be happy to let you close.
Just finish my statement?
Sure.
Before you, but my point is that with the charter schools, the issue was, are we going to renew them based on some alternative framework? The school doesn't have a renewal issue, it just has an accountability score issue. So we're not looking as to whether they're still going to exist or not exist. I mean, it's just like any program, whether it's, the school for the deaf, the school for the visually impaired, they're not on the brink of anybody closing the school. I mean, we're not talking about closing a traditional school. We're talking about the school is in comprehensive intervention required, just like all the rest. But it's not like the charter schools where it's a renewal issue.
Right.
So we're not
much
looking
higher
at
stakes for the charter
frameworks right now.
Right.
For this school or any traditional school, except in the larger context of what we're going to hopefully move toward.
In the future.
But I don't know what's imperative. Like, what action would we be taking, Superintendent? I mean, with.
I think the local district would argue that it's imperative that they've been dealing with this for a long time.
Here's what I think. I think that it feels like this is an artifice that someone created policy-wise. I mean, not the institution itself, where. A, this district must accept students that are sent. Mm-hmm. B, where they must accept responsibility for accountability. Third, where the students must be of a particular background. All of those things are policy decisions that somebody at some point made. I think it's at least, even before getting the discussion you're describing, Ms. Boucher, it would be worth talking through, are all of those things the right, is that the right policy? And pursuing a policy change if they're not. I mean, it is a little bit abnormal, and I think it's worth asking all the policies that came together to create this situation. Are there policies that we should change, even if we have to ask the legislature to change them, in order to produce a less abnormal circumstance? Now, you still might be left with a school that serves exclusively students with severe disabilities, and we don't have an answer for that on accountability. I'm just thinking right now, should the idea that this district and this school, must take on that accountability burden, that's not just a function of the accountability system, it's also a function of particular policies particular to this school that have made it this way for them. And I'm just wondering whether we should
So are we
change
looking
those.
for a score other than the accountability score or a secondary score for the school? I mean, what are we being asked to do?
You're not being asked to do anything today. I think I need to sit down with the superintendent and
Yeah.
try to see.
You're going to be getting ready to be asked to do something in just a minute when I make a motion. Is it time now?
Yes,
Okay.
it's time to make a
I have
motion.
one question
All right.
before we go. So, what's the difference between this school and the special school district school in Alexandria? Aren't they serving similar kids, or it's a different part of the spectrum?
There's a big difference between them, although the initial proposal was to include them all in that, because there's actually two of those there. There's the one out on Highway 28, that's in the special school district, and then what was the name of the other one, Tommy, that was over in Pineville? I guess, is it still
Pinecrest?
Pinecrest, yeah. So, but the point here, to me, is that we've been talking about alternative schools and alternative school frameworks for at least 15 years, because I've been involved in the discussion that long. We have a discussion half the morning involving how it applies to a charter school, and I will tell you that in my mind, there's not another school in the state of Louisiana anywhere similar to this, and I think that's the point that you were making, Dr. Bophy. My motion is to direct the superintendent to sit down with the staff from Rapides Parish School Board and his staff, and to look at specific policy changes or whatever it takes to come up with a fair system for them. And then if, the second part of my motion is to ask the board to put together a committee on to make policy advisements on alternative school frameworks. And I may not get a second.
Can we repeat that? I want to make sure.
Yeah, let's get the staff a chance to get it written down.
Yeah, I don't know
and
if I
we'll-
can repeat it.
How do we frame, is it framed as a substitute motion or amend the motion? It doesn't matter.
It's whatever y'all want to do.
Okay,
The motion
well-
on the floor right now is to
Amending
receive the
the-
report.
amending
Okay.
probably amending the motion.
Okay, well, this is
Okay.
a substitute motion then.
So a substitute motion, and the substitute motion is to direct the superintendent and his staff to sit down with Rapides Parish School System staff to identify a solution relative to this particular school. There's a second part where, and I'm going to use the word work group instead of committee as not to confuse it with a committee we're sitting in now, but for a work group of BESE members to work with the superintendent on a framework for alternative schools. And I hear the superintendent elevating that there needs to be a definition of what an alternative school is, and that that'll be part of that process.
Right.
Sorry for messing that up. Yes.
Makes sense to me.
So-
I can second that.
Just a question.
Yes, Ms. Boche.
The committee that is supposedly working on this right now, how would that interact with this new work group that we're talking about forming?
That committee has produced a lot of findings related specifically to schools for students that have had behavioral interventions. And, we're going to have to make decisions about that too. But I think that those would be somewhat easier decisions. For example, I think we'll be making decisions, if a student is suspended for a week, should that student be in an alternative school or in an alternative program? And is it different for somebody who has been expelled, for example? I think those decisions are probably easier than the decisions about different gradations of disabilities and those sorts of
But
things.
we're going to look at it all together.
I believe this working group that Ms. Bophy and Dr. Jones's motion describes is about all of it altogether.
All of it all
Yes,
together.
ma'am. Yeah.
So we have a motion by Dr. Jones, and we have a second by Mr. Davis. Board members, is there any other discussion on this item? Is there any objection? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
Before we go, do we need another motion to receive the report?
I think that was
No.
supposed to be tied
Staff.
in with that.
Nope, we're fine. What's
Board-
our next item?
Your next item is on page 2, item 2.2, consideration of the fall 2017 reading report. The department recommendation is to receive the report and direct the LDE to submit the report to the House and Senate Committees on Education.
Guys, we need a motion.
So moved.
So we have Dr. Davis, Mr. Davis, and Ms. Holloway.
I like the sound of that.
Are there any comment cards on this item? No. No comment cards. Superintendent, any discussion?
No, thank you.
Board members, any questions? Is there any objection, board members? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
Your next item is on page 52, item 2.3, consideration of an extension of the performance profiles for Type 3 early learning centers impacted by the federally declared disaster DR 4277. The department recommendation is to approve the one-time extension for Kids Haven Center in Tangipahoa Parish and for Kingdom Early Learning Center in East Baton Rouge Parish.
Board members, we need a motion. Thank you, Ms. Fauché. A second by Mr. Davis. Do we have any comment cards?
No, ma'am.
Are there any questions about this item, board members? Is there any objection? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
Your next item is on page 57, item 4.1, consideration of revisions to Bulletin 1566, pupil progression policies and procedures relative to student promotion and summer remediation. The department recommendation is to approve as notice of intent. Revised backup documentation has been distributed.
We need a motion. Thank you, Mr. Rock. A second by Dr. Thomason. I have a public comment card from Ms. Shum. Ms. Shum, we're on 4.1, the pupil progression policies and procedures. And while you have the floor, if there's
anything else I want to say?
I wouldn't say anything, but I'll be a little more generous as you waited so patiently.
Thank you very much. Just on that last item, I just would like to say that there's a big issue between alternative programs and alternative schools because there is a significant difference in what is measured. And I think that's the whole picture. And I think Superintendent White has that right. You have a very fine line. I totally believe in inclusion. I would hate to see anything that's going to make that any less in schools. But I also know that if it's an alternative program and a student is simply sitting in that program and there's no accountability on anyone's part about what happens in that for a student to be able to come back and re-enter into a regular school and be able to function, that we're not measuring the right thing. I think we don't measure the right thing. That's where the problem is. And I think there needs to be something looked at in the accountability system that says for alternative schools or programs, what are we measuring for the student's best interest? That's all I wanted to say.
Very nuanced discussion, and I encourage you to continue to dialogue with the board members as we proceed in this area. And on this item, relative to pupil progression.
On this item, I just have a concern on page 2, one of the items that's being suggested to be changed, and I understand that part of it is because remediation during the summer is very difficult because of the timing when the tests come back. But if it's, I think it's letter B, part, that third paragraph where it says a student, any first-time 8th grade student who does not meet the passing standards set forth in this bulletin, and any student not eligible for any waiver pursuant to section 707 of this bulletin, after being offered summer remediation, may be placed on a high school campus in transitional 9th grade. And my concern on that is the removal of the remediation. And I also see that in letter I, that you're saying that an LEA can review the student's academic record to determine appropriate placement in 9th grade or transitional 9th grade. I'd just like to suggest that so that there is some balance at the local level, if they want to offer remediation, that the LEA can make that determination. Because I think it puts a student in a difficult spot. They have not passed any of their 8th grade tests, and all of a sudden they're going to be on a high school campus with no remediation and not have to take anything to help them catch up, that there's going to be some magic wand that everybody waves when they get into the 9th grade and they're all of a sudden going to know everything. So I just think that that section, if the same language that was there about saying that the LEA shall review the record and make a recommendation on remediation, not having it be summer remediation, because I understand that's an issue because of when the test is done, and it's left up to the local level. Simply saying that you only have to offer it when some students may need to be told you need remediation, I think is something that you need to consider.
So are you questioning the extent to which the student is obligated to participate in the remediation?
Yes.
Is that your concern?
Yes, that's my
Students
concern.
not being obligated to participate in the remediation?
Yes, and students are really smart about figuring out rules. So they're going to know, okay, I don't have to go to summer remediation. I don't have to pass the test for the first time in 8th grade. And what is the incentive? If it's at the district level and the school looks at it and reviews the record and says maybe the kid didn't pass the test because he's academically capable and just didn't try, but maybe if he had some extra work and some support, he would be able to function better when he got to the high school. I understand that this is to help us with a little bit with the dropouts issue, but I also think that there needs to be some local balance of how do you make sure that the student is really prepared to enter into that 9th grade coursework.
So, Dr. Bobby, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Debbie, are you saying that it should be mandated and not just offered at the district level?
I'm saying that the district should decide whether it can be mandated or not that it's just offered.
Instead of the DOE?
Yes. I'm saying that it's the same language that I think that's in letter I, where it says the LEA shall review the student. If that same language was there, you review the record, you determine if they need remediation. And I don't think it needs to just be summer remediation, because I think that's where the issue is. Summer remediation doesn't work when you find out in July that the kid didn't pass the test and you've got 2 weeks before school starts. But if they move to a high school campus, some type of remediation, either after school, during a particular course, I just think that there should be an option of the district being able to say and mandate, if necessary, that the student must take a remedial course. Or not a course, remediation, however it's termed to be.
Ms. Fauché?
Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in your local pupil progression plan, you can do that. So this is a bulletin with a minimum requirement. You can offer remediation to students, but as locally in your local plan, you can mandate it if that's what you want your district to do. Just like to exit 8th grade, some districts may say you have to pass all your subject matter, all of the subjects. One says you could fail one says you could fail 2 to go to summer school. What this plan does, since the results are not going to be in until mid-June, that we're mandated in order to make them T9 to at least offer the summer remediation to those that we identify as struggling students. Now, if a district wants to go further and say, in our district it's mandated, we have every right to do so. And then the type of remediation, once we put them on the 9th grade campus, as you well know with T9s, you've got to provide those supports as part of the transitional 9th grade program, which will remediate in the subject area in which they have deficiencies in many ways. So I really think this is going to give flexibility to the districts in how they wish to remediate students, whether it be through a short or a longer summer remediation program, or a shorter one combined with something you're doing at the 9th grade level, or doing it all as they move in. So
and that's my clarification. When I read it and I read the other one said that the district could review, as long as the district has the right to be able to mandate remediation for that student that's moving up, I think that's fine.
The district can be more restrictive. Am I not correct, Superintendent?
He was nodding as you were speaking.
Okay.
Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I agree with Ms. Fauché that the flexibility is already there for a local district to do that. But I would suggest, Superintendent White, that if this policy passes, that in your clarification letter out to the districts, you emphasize what Dr. Shum just said, that it is Dr. Shum, is it? All right. Non-Dr. Shum just said about, I was promoting you there, the flexibility of the district. The other thing that bothers me, and I'm somewhere in the back of my mind, that word summer is in the law, is it?
Yes.
I'm wondering why we don't try to get that word removed from the statute to give the flexibility, or to redefine, because to me, an effective remediation program is not going to happen in July and August it's got to go on. So
Especially when we start August 1st.
yeah, and so maybe we could also pursue in this legislative session to clarify that word summer, to say an effective remediation program instead of summer or something like that.
Thank you. Anybody else? Is there any objection? Hearing none, motion passes. What's our next item?
That concludes your agenda.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.